Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another illustrious episode of Den of Sin with Devin and James. We've got an incredible episode this week. Devin, I'll even go on to say I think we bit off more than we can chew with this episode. Why don't you tell our listeners, our lovely listeners, our cinemaniacs, as I'm now going to start calling them, why don't you kind of tell the audience what this episode is about?
All right. Well, this episode is about the very lengthy topic, as it turned out, of 1974, the films of 1974. And the reason I chose this particular year is because my parents just celebrated their wedding anniversary last week, and they were married in 1974, and I thought, wouldn't it be fun? I know they listen, so, you know, our two listeners are my folks.
We're lucky to have them.
But this is for them. But when I asked, I said, can we do 1974? Your eyes lit up because it seemed like you had that year in your mind too. What were your reasons for being excited about 1974?
It was literally just, well, that's the funny thing is, because I was going to suggest, we didn't even talk really about having a specific year, but that was sort of one of my ideas. And for some reason, for me, it was just a number that came to my head. Like mid-70s is sort of, I mean, the 70s in general is sort of like my sweet spot. Mid-70s specifically, for some reason, just I know it's going to be an interesting, like without knowing, I mean, there was a few films I knew that were released that year, some pretty big films that were released that year. So I sort of had that in the back of my head. It was just sort of a number that came to me. I knew it was going to have some good films that year, some really interesting films that year, just because that was the decade. But it was interesting that you, like I said, it was very surprising that you had offered that same year. You had a reason, I didn't. And then once we started talking about it, I started researching all the films that year, and I almost said, like, took it back, like, this is too much, because this is an insane year for movies.
It is, you know, and I didn't expect it either. I knew it was a great year. I mean, just off the top of my head, I could name off a few 74 films, but then really looking at the list, it's interesting. I mean, you pulled it out of a hat. I had a reason for it, but the reason wasn't film-centric. And recently we did a podcast on the year 1980, and similarly with that, we chose that just because there were so many films celebrating a 40th anniversary. It had nothing to do with
That's right.
our expectations going in that it was such a phenomenal year. And I got to admit, looking at the films of 1974 and then coupling this with the feelings that we both had over 1980, there's a little part of me that kept on getting really angry that movies today, COVID or otherwise.
Yeah, you texted me this.
Like I was getting so frustrated and downright angry at times. I'm like, why aren't we making movies like this anymore? You know, why does everything have a cape? And I have nothing against Marvel and DC and Star Wars, and you know, we just lost Chadwick Boseman, which is a tremendous loss to the industry and to the world.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm not calling for those kind of films to no longer be made. I just kind of like to see more of the other films Chadwick Boseman was in than Black Panther.
Yeah.
I loved him as Jackie Robinson. I loved him as Thurgood Marshall. And I loved him as Black Panther too, but I want to see more films about real people, not just true life stories, but films about people who
that's the thing is spiders. It's not that's the thing though, like, you know, as I definitely love genre films. You know, I have a soft spot for horror movies, for thrillers and monster movies and all different kinds of things, kung fu movies. But I mean, I just love cinema. And one thing like the 70s were really great at, as we'll definitely talk about tonight, is just the breadth of films. Like there was not one dominant genre of films that were being made. In fact, really interestingly, the top earners, the highest grossing films of this year were kind of definitely all over the board too, as far as the subject matter. And, you know, there were movies for adults. And I think that's kind of the different thing is there's nothing wrong with all ages films and focusing it on the wider audience possible, but that does almost limit what you can do and what you can say. And everything now, I mean, it's not even just Marvel movies or the big tentpole sort of, you know, like the Marvel movies, superhero movies, those kind of movies. It's just everything now is a remake or an adaptation of pre-existing material. That's a video game movie. It's based off of a popular book franchise. It's a remake of a remake of a remake. It's a sequel of a sequel of a sequel. And it's kind of it's lost its luster. It's no longer exciting. And there's just not enough people doing anything different or taking chances. especially in the way that people were taking chances in the 70s, especially as we said, we'll talk about this year. This year had some really exciting films, very like different from what was happening, even at the time. And there was a lot of groundbreaking movies here, some very huge movies. I'm not one that's like, oh, everything that is new sucks, everything that's old is great.
No.
There's movies that came out in 1974 that were terrible, like, but yeah, it's definitely like I miss auteurs. I miss filmmakers who had a vision and were going to make that vision, and then we're going to compromise to reach test audiences. And again, we'll talk about some pretty important and groundbreaking films, and some films that really were pushing the boundaries of things. But I'm excited. Like I said, it's definitely, there's no way we're going to get to every movie released in 1974. In fact, there's probably there's more than a few films on this that we'll talk about tonight that deserve their own whole episodes that have already been talked to death, but are such important films and such have such a legend that you can't really exhaust it just because the films have that kind of presence. But yeah, I'm excited. I know you have a lot to say. I was looking at the list.
Yeah.
There's a lot of movies on this list that either I heard about through you or I watched with you. That's always going to be a running theme with this podcast. But yeah, I'm excited. So obviously, I like to kick this off with you. Like, if there's a specific film you want to start off with, or just your opinion on the decade as a whole, or the year as a whole.
Let's start it off with something fun, just to prove it's not all sour grapes. If we're not painting a target on Marvel, if we were painting a target on Marvel, it's because they're so damn good and because they have so much talent behind them. Some of the greatest directors of all time are making Marvel movies now because that's the only way that a great director can really make a living at this point, quit their day job.
That's right.
But just to show that 1974 wasn't devoid of tentpole films, let's get this started with a couple of disaster movies, starting with the number one movie of the year was The Towering Inferno. Have you seen The Towering Inferno?
I have. It was one of my mom's favorite movie. My mom, may she rest in peace, she loved disaster films. So Earthquake, Airplane, like there's a lot of films even from this year that she was a big fan of, but her favorite of all time, she really loved The Towering Inferno, and she really loved Poseidon's Adventure, but The Towering Inferno was like her favorite. She loved like some of the later ones, like the volcano movies and stuff from the 90s and stuff, but her favorite of all of them was always Towering Inferno. So it was a movie I watched a lot as a kid.
Yeah, I watched it a lot too. It was on TV a lot. Good call on the Poseidon Adventure. They're almost kind of companion pieces. Poseidon Adventure was a few years ahead of this, so we aren't going to go too deep into that. But it did kind of start a little bit of the trend. But Towering Inferno was a great film, despite all of its trappings. But there's some fun stuff, though. Paul Newman and Steve McQueen as the co-stars on this movie. I don't think people realized just how competitive they were. They're both competitive by nature. Nobody's more competitive than Steve McQueen. And he brought it out even more in Paul Newman. But a couple of things that I found kind of funny. First off, was pertinent to them that they get billed together. They couldn't have one person billed over the other. So I'm not sure which one's on the left or on the right, but they're billed left to right, and one name, the name on the left is placed lower than the name on the right. So there's one who's on top of the other, but mentioned second. That was their compromise for how they were going to both get top billing. Because they were literally arguing over, well, whose name gets mentioned first. And apparently McQueen blew up and like practically left the set when he found out that Paul Newman had exactly 12 more lines of dialogue than him.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. There's actually there's a cartoonist named Tim Lane who's a phenomenal cartoonist, and his last 3 books have all been about Steve McQueen. Like, sort of, some of them are very autobiographical, and some of them are sort of like based on real things that happened, but sort of in a fantastical nature. So I've been reading those a lot. He's a phenomenal cartoonist, but like any film lover, I love Steve McQueen. He's one of the most, he's single-handedly probably the most like masculine actor ever somehow. Like, just not even in, just he exuded like this sort of what a classical sense of manliness was, but a lot of that came with his competitive spirit. So it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me at all. And especially also knowing that, Paul Newman was sort of also an alpha dog, and Paul Newman was more classically handsome. And I think that always bothers Steve McQueen. Like, I don't think, I think he knew he wasn't,
Newman's
exactly
prettier.
like
Newman
the best looking dude. Newman's way prettier. Yeah. But he wins that for most people.
But I love them both.
That's interesting because exactly, me too.
And Towering Inferno was nominated for a ton of Oscars on top of the technical stuff. Fred Astaire was nominated for an Oscar on this, and he actually won the Golden Globe. And
he did. Yeah.
I always found it interesting that Fred Astaire ultimately won for the Towering Inferno and not for a movie that he dances in.
I know.
Now, the Golden Globes and the Oscars in 1974 were actually quite different. We'll get into that maybe a little bit as we get into some of the heavier hitters. In terms of finishing out,
I found them surprisingly. I'm sorry, Devin. I was just going to say, no, I don't do my homework. I usually let you do your homework, but this was a year because I found it so fascinating that I did sort of do some research. And I was honestly pretty surprised about, first off, the highest earners. Although I guess after I read that, I was like, I guess that's not that surprising. But even, some of the Oscar noms were pretty interesting. But I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, it's all good. I was just going to take us on to the next disaster film, though. Airport 1975, I think in the grand scheme of things, I think we can kind of skip that one. That's Karen Black won a Golden Globe for that. I'm not trying to completely skip it, but I want to talk about Earthquake.
Yeah,
because I find Earthquake to be one of the lesser films if I'm getting straight down to the details, but it's still fun to watch, and I love the idea of Sense-Around. Did you ever hear about the film being shown in Sense-Around?
I've heard the gimmick of it, but I never experienced it, so I can't even speak to it. But why don't you go ahead and explain it to our listeners what that entailed?
Well, Earthquake is about exactly what it sounds like if you haven't seen it. Giant, I think it was a 9-minute long earthquake occurs in California and tears apart the lives of Charlton Heston and Lorne Greene and Ava Gardner and several other big name stars. But one of the real hooks of Earthquake, and I do want to mention while I'm in the cast here, I was looking this up because I actually need to have this spelled out in front of me if I'm going to even attempt to pronounce it. Walter Matthau plays a small part as a drunk in the movie at a bar who thinks maybe the earthquake is something he's imagining. And he's credited as Walter Matuszynski.
Is that his real name?
No. I don't know exactly what the story is behind that. It's a cameo. So somebody in the credit office was obviously having fun. They weren't going to credit him as having been in the entire movie for showing up for 5 seconds for basically a sight gag. But yeah, it's spelled Walter and then Matuszhanskyy. So there's no way that was a typo or it's not his name backwards.
No, yeah.
But
there's too many Y's in that to be accidental.
To move on beyond that, though, Earthquake was released in something called Sense-Around. And there were a couple of other movies. There was one called Roller Coaster that was released in Sense-Around, and the film version of Battlestar Galactica was released in Sense-Around. And what it basically was, it was a speaker system that had such a low bass that it would make you feel like your seat was rumbling.
It was trembling.
Yeah. Yes, which is perfect for Earthquake, obviously. And I'd always known it was shot or put out there in Sense-Around. It wasn't shot in Sense-Around because there's no such thing. But I didn't know that they stopped doing it because it was causing structural issues where chunks of ceiling were actually falling down on people watching the movie. And it gave a few people nosebleeds, which has got to be... even William Castle in all of his great...
I was just about to say, he wasn't tearing down cinemas. Yeah. Not for lack of trying, though, but...
And because they couldn't do the Sense-Around experience on television, NBC, when they aired Earthquake, I thought this was interesting. They actually simulcast it on FM radio so that people could get a stereo sound for the movie because so many people didn't have stereo TVs yet.
That's crazy. I did not know that.
So, I mean, this is all to talk about Earthquake without really saying much of anything about the movie itself.
I still can't imagine anybody, even at the time, going trying to finagle that. Let's get the radios. I'm sure they offered it, but I'm just wondering how many people tried to take advantage. Although, who knows? 74, maybe that was the height of excitement of the time. I don't know. Seems like a lot of work to do. I still remember when that Flaming Lips album came out that you had to get all the different stereos to play. That was a pain in the ass.
It was awful. We tried. Granted, we were inhibiting ourselves with some of the substances that were also being passed around the house that night. This is 20 years ago.
That go along with listening to the Flaming Lips, yeah.
Yes. But yeah,
to all our millennial listeners, the Flaming Lips were a band. They were a sort of psychedelic band. We'll just leave it at that.
I also never really had any luck with perfectly syncing up Dark Side of the Moon with Wizard of Oz, just saying.
I have a very funny story, Devin. I have to pause it right here. It involves you, an informative experience in my life. Because maybe this isn't a conversation for this podcast, but it involves some psychedelics and you convincing me that while everybody else was trying to convince me to listen to Pink Floyd, you're like, no, man, gotta listen to Dean Martin. And Dean Martin's orchestra was literally making the wind, like it was like the wind and Dean Martin music were tied together, and like it was amazing. It was one of the formative experiences of my life, and it changed me as a person. So anyways, that's another Devin memory for me.
I'm glad that I could have that sort of impact on you. And just like to say one more time, happy anniversary, Mom and Dad. But yeah, so Earthquake. It's funny, there's a lot of movies on this list that I've seen, but I haven't seen recently enough to really feel like I'm knowledgeable enough about it to talk about it. Like I could have vague memories. I have vague memories of like, even where I was when I watched it, but the film as a whole. But one thing that this list did really for me was I literally wrote down, like, I need to rewatch this, or I need to watch this, I've never even watched this, I need to watch this. And there's even films on there, like some films we'll talk about that I've even seen kind of recently, but I got excited for them, like, I'm going to rewatch this again. So that's the power of 1974, I guess. So yeah, no, I'm in the same boat. Several of them I just kind of had to file away and say, okay, I think I know enough about this one. I think I remember enough about this one. But I did have to rewatch a few, and I watched a few for the first time. What was one that you hadn't seen before? What was a new one for you?
There's actually quite a bit. Like I said, there's actually a lot. There's actually a lot of the movie Persecution I've never seen with Lana Turner, the movie Legacy of Satan. A lot of the horror ones I've seen because that's just the way that's going to go. But there was one that won the an Oscar, I think it was for Best Actor, that I had never even seen before. I had even heard about. I've seen Zardoz, unfortunately.
I saw Zardoz for the first time.
Oh, did you really?
Yes.
So one of the movies that I was interested in, just because I saw that Art Carney had won it for Best Actor, was a movie called Harry and Tonto, which I've never heard of. I have no idea what it is, but knowing Art Carney was somebody that my dad really loved, and it was weird that he won it for Best Actor for a film I'd never heard of. So that was a film that I was like, shoot, I need to see that. And it was definitely a performance if he won the Academy Award for Best Actor in 1974, I think I need to see that performance. So.
Unfortunately, it's hard to find. I wasn't able to find it anywhere to rewatch it. I have seen it. It's been a really long time. I think you'll dig it because his co-star is a cat.
I already sold.
And Ellen Burstyn is in it as well, and she was the Best Actress winner, but for a different movie. Harry and Tonto is a really good film. It's exactly the kind of film that we're talking about when we say that nobody makes this kind of movie anymore. I am curious, though, because the list for the people up for Best Actor that year is pretty intense. I wonder if the poll between, without getting too far ahead of myself, I'll just say Al Pacino and Jack Nicholson. I think the poll between those two may have given Carney the win.
That's interesting. That's actually probably pretty dead on, actually, yeah.
And the two of them, Pacino didn't win jack shit, and Nicholson did end up winning the Golden Globe. So odd that Pacino never won for, we'll just say, for Michael Corleone.
The Pacino film was represented in several other categories, though. So the film itself.
Well, let's go ahead and go that direction. Godfather Part 2. What are your feelings on Godfather Part 2? Do you believe that it was the first great sequel, as a lot of people do, or that it deserved the Oscar, or any? I
mean, it definitely deserves its place as one of the greatest sequels ever made. I mean, it's considered one of the most. A lot of film lovers will put it as one of the greatest American movies ever made. Period. Let alone sequels or whatever. Being 100% honest, I'm not a huge fan of the Godfather series. I mean, I definitely respect them. I understand why they're great. The performances are great, but for whatever reason, they don't resonate with me as strongly as other films. And it's not to say that they're not good films. Weirdly, though, I still like God. I know why people love Godfather Part 2, but I still kind of enjoy it just as a watcher. I enjoyed the first Godfather more, I think. I I don't have anything like. There's not a specific reason. I just think it's not that The Godfather Part 2 is tedious. It's I don't know. It's more about them as characters, less about sort of the lascivious things that go on with like the mafioso and stuff. And not that they're. I don't know. It's a great movie. I wouldn't say it. Definitely would never say it's not a great movie. But I don't love it in the same way like lots of people do. And it's not to say I don't like it. It's just there are other movies that came out this year that I like more, but not that those movies are better movies. If you know what I mean. Like, does that make any kind of sense to you?
Makes perfect sense.
You know your feelings.
I love The Godfather Part 2. It's a tough call to say whether I like it better than the first one. They're so different.
Yes, exactly.
While at the same time feeling so organic to one another.
Yeah.
I think some of the impact that Godfather 2 had on the audience in 1974 is a little blunted now due to the fact that we have had so many prequels that have been successful at the box office. And it's to call Godfather Part 2 a prequel is only a half-truth to begin with. It is a proper sequel as well as a prequel. Yeah. And I can imagine in 1974 just being completely blown away by this concept of taking the story backwards and forwards simultaneously. I don't think that's something that works nowadays, not because it doesn't work, but because the impact of it doesn't work, because it almost feels like, okay, what else you got? Because we've seen all that. And part of why we've seen all that is because of the success of Godfather Part 2. It also has some fantastic performances. Everybody. Yeah,
I mean, the top to bottom.
I will say, though, I'm not even entirely sure that it's my favorite Coppola movie of 1974. I'm a huge fan of The Conversation, and perhaps for this block we'll talk about some of the double headers that we have this year, because 1974 was an incredible year for some double headers here. And the first double header is Francis Ford Coppola releasing The Godfather Part 2 and The Conversation in the same year. And I believe one hinged on the other. I think he agreed to do Godfather Part 2 for Paramount based on the idea that he got to do The Conversation to begin with. And that's his personal favorite of his work. Anyone that has not seen The Conversation, it was also nominated for a buttload of Oscars and Golden Globes. But The Conversation stars Gene Hackman, who is one of my favorite actors. I wish he'd come out of retirement just to do one more movie so that I can say that his last movie wasn't Welcome to Mooseport.
Exactly.
But it's such a quiet film. It's one man who he's a surveillance expert, and he has recorded this conversation between a man and a woman in a park, and those two people ended up dead. And so he becomes obsessed with trying to piece together this conversation and get a pure copy of the recording, partly because he's obsessed with figuring out what happened, but he also starts to get incredibly paranoid that someone might be coming after him now. And these two things start to feed into each other. And it really is one of my favorite cheats in cinema history. We talked about cheats during the Brian De Palma conversation. Yeah. There are multiple versions of the conversation that he listens to within the film. So as he gets the conversation clearer and clearer and is able to hear the words more clearly, there are multiple, like some versions of the conversation, they don't say the thing that he's now zeroing in on. So he's not discovering new clues. He's being fed new clues by the director. So I just kind of think that's a fun sort of behind the magic sort of thing. It also has a very early appearance by Harrison Ford several years prior to Han Solo, which is kind of fun. And it has Coppola regular Robert Duvall in it as well. Did we watch The Conversation together? Was that one that we saw at my first apartment?
No, I saw that when I was living in when I lived in Alameda, California, in the right outside of Oakland. We had a local library there that was incredible. They had the films that you could check out from the library. They had pretty much, at the time, probably 75% of the Criterion collection. I mean, just amazing films, amazing records, too. They had these great, like, Americana roots records and blues records and country records. We fell in love with the library just because it was such, and it was like a 100-year-old building, and it was just rad. So that's, I think that's the first time. I might have watched it younger, but I also might just not have been sober enough to maybe remember it or whatever. But the first time I remember watching it was renting it from there. I think we rented like 6 movies that weekend, and then we burned them all through. And I think The Conversation was probably one of the more impressive films. I think it was that, and did we see 3 Women Was it the same weekend? I don't know. Then that was true. It would have been Three Women would have been the best movie I saw that weekend, but The Conversation would have been a close second. Yeah, no, it's a great movie. To see a younger, he always felt like, even at the time, he always felt like an older guy.
Yeah.
It's, Gene Hackman is so incredible. And he's really good in that role that he brings really like visceral and palpable tension and stuff. So yeah, great. I mean, it's like a character study, even more than it is like a narrative film.
Yeah. The Conversation.
I would actually
interesting part of the movie.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
It's watching him and his paranoia over being left a birthday present. Just kind of seeing how his mind works. And Hackman just dives right into it. He learned how to play saxophone for the role. And
oh, no kidding.
Yeah, which is great because the character's not even a good saxophone player, but he taught himself how to play so that he could at least show that this guy had something else to obsess on once in a while, to try to take his mind off of everything else that he was driven crazy by. And there were rumors that Enemy of the State with Gene Hackman and Will Smith?
Yeah.
Remember the rumors back then that was supposed to be Harry Caul at an older age?
I've never heard that.
Yeah.
I've never heard that. I don't think.
It was a thing. It was at least a thing amongst a lot of the geeks we were hanging out with at the time.
I might have heard at the time, but I do not remember that. But I can see it.
My guess is that there's no connection. In fact, it's not even a guess. I can tell you there's no connection. But I can tell you Tony Scott probably had the thought himself while he was directing the movie Enemy of the People or Enemy of the State. Because he is another paranoid surveillance expert in that. And then that's not a bad movie either. It's one that time's kind of forgotten, despite the fact that it has 90s superstar Will Smith right in the height of his fame. That is probably the least talked about Will Smith movie from that era, and it's at least way more worth talking about than Wild Wild West.
Yeah, well, yeah. That's definite. But I think it was that time of where there's a glut of these sort of like political thrillery kind of movies that were coming out. So I think a lot of them just got lost in translation. Just like there's just too many of those like government. Yeah, like there was a lot of that in that midnight. I mean, I'll give it a rewatch. I do remember seeing it at the time. I do remember not being like that into it. Like not, or maybe just, again, maybe I was just distracted at the time, but it's one that like every time it comes up, because again, I would love Gene Hackman. It's how do you not love Gene Hackman? Even if he's was a big old bully and a mean person, how do you not love Gene Hackman? But it's one of those movies just like, I just don't like, there's a lot of those films, like not that saying they're all exactly the same, but like Clear and Present Danger and The Net and all those like Michael Crichton books, or, like just these like sort of, they have a lot of like espionage or thriller aspects to it, but like political thrillers. And somehow that shit I just never connected with it. But
well, there's a few in 74 that are really
and I do
good.
love the conversation.
Yeah. Political thrillers really kind of were a thing until somewhat recently. And they kind of seem to go out of fashion. I'm sure they'll come back at some point. But to keep the 1974 train going here, you mentioned Three Women, another double header this year. Like I said, there were several, and a few of them I'll mention casually. But there's three that I want to mention here at the front. First one was Coppola. The next one's Robert Altman. Robert Altman directed this year Thieves Like Us, which is a period piece, sort of a remake, but not an Altman remake.
It's a Robert Altman remake, yeah.
Yes, with Keith Carradine and Shelley Duvall, which is a good movie if you ever get a chance. But the one that I really love of his from 1974 is California Split, starring...
And here's the thing. I mean, he has a huge filmography, but I love Robert Altman, but those are two of the movies when I talked about them, like, I have not seen either one of those. And California Split, like, is one of those films that, like, I'm like, oh, I need to watch this, but I just somehow have never come across it, so...
You need to see California Split. I think you would enjoy California Split. I went back and rewatched it. I was lucky enough the first time I saw it. I was working at a theater in New York City where we had a whole Altman in the 70s retrospective. And I got to see California Split and The Long Goodbye like in the same week on the big screen for the first time. And grew up an Elliot Gould fan. Sure, Devil and Max Devlin was something that I used to see when I was little, but I didn't realize how cool he could be. That's really the power of Robert Altman, was that he could make Elliot Gould seem cool.
Yeah.
And in California Split, it's Elliot Gould and your other favorite actor, George Segal. And I know you do not like George Segal, but I'm telling you, this movie will broaden your appreciation for him, not because it displays a range that you've never seen before, but because it's the right kind of movie for the energy that he naturally brings to things. I think that's the problem a lot of people have with George Segal is he has a weird energy. It's not a positive or a negative. It just rubs people the wrong way sometimes. It can come off as really phony or disingenuous in some cases. It can come off like bad acting in some cases, which it usually isn't, but sometimes is in his case.
It is weird though how for some reason in my head those two actors are linked somehow. Maybe I did see it. I don't know if they played similar roles in that, like in like the later end of their careers, like they played like TV dads or something. I don't know what it is specifically that I have those two actors sort of linked, but I didn't think it was because of California. So maybe they've been in another movie together, but it's just weird. I think it's just more of like the characters they played in the twilight of their age. I think they were sitcom dads in a few things.
Yeah, they're both sitcom dads, aren't they?
Yeah.
But in this, they're both youngish. I'm not going to say. They're in their 40s, I would probably say, and they're both playing different versions of degenerate gamblers, where Elliot Gould is much more of a professional gambler who is kind of just walking through life and doing everything on a whim, and he seems well enough studied in what he's doing. You know, he knows which horses have a bum leg and things like that as he's going to the track, but he's much more of a free spirit, whereas George Segal is the damaged gambler who is he's a journalist, seems like he works for like a Rolling Stone or something like that, though they never name it. And he's the one with the bookie on his back, and he's trying to go for this big score because, you know, that's what happens in gambling movies. And in fact, there's other gambling movies. Even in 1974, James Caan was nominated for awards for playing the lead in a movie called The Gambler that was remade recently with Mark Wahlberg. Never saw the Wahlberg version, did see the Caan version, and he's very good. But what I like about California Split more is that the stakes aren't played up in that stereotypical sort of my bookie's gonna break my legs sort of way. You meet George Segal's bookie. He's this little guy who's pleading with him, please, come on, I need the money too. I got people to pay. He never says I'm gonna break your legs or I'm gonna, kill your dog or anything like that. He doesn't say he won't. So there's the thought in the back of your head that this could go very bad for George Segal if he doesn't pay up. And he does continue to dig himself this hole, but it's still his bookie saying, what am I going to do with you? You owe me money from this. What am I going to do with you? It's never you get the money or I'm going to twist your thumbs, And I like
exactly. It doesn't go into that. Yeah.
The stakes never rise to this level where you're worried about life and death. You're only really concentrating on the winning or the losing. And as a result, you end up with a film that's probably closer to the truth of what it's like to be a gambling addict.
Addictive gambler. Yeah.
And to see Elliot Gould as the guy who seems to be able to be okay with it, just like you see a functional alcoholic, whereas George Segal is the non-functioning version of that. And their ups and downs are not based on story beats. They're just based on how they're going to do at the track or how they're going to do in this poker game. And they ultimately end up going to Reno instead of Vegas, which I think is a conscious choice as well to not do the typical gambling movie. But at the same time, a lot more honest and straightforward about probably how depressing it can be to be a degenerate gambler. That's
the one thing I will say. And I think that's what's really missing about films is that probably more than anything else is that films were okay being a bummer. Like it wasn't a bad thing to be a bummer of a movie. You could have bummer endings. You could have characters that don't really learn their lesson. You could do a very much more realistic take on humanity without like audience test scores saying this movie depresses me and having like, if that's what I say, they're just much more interesting films because of that. And Altman himself is obviously, has done he's a huge filmography, but he's done all different kinds of movies, but not a lot of them are like cheerful films. But,
no, he's not.
Which was what I like
for that.
No, but it's usually the performances and the fact that he lets his actors sort of really take center stage. He's not trying to force a style on them. He wants them to be actors and sort of make very organic decisions and stuff. And it's why he's Robert Altman. But yeah, it's definitely a movie I need to see.
And he affords it to all of his actors. This is this wasn't the first one because MASH was the first one. But this was another one where he mic'd every actor in the scene. And it probably will drive some people crazy. There's conversations between George Segal and Elliot Gould at the bar where you can't really hear what they're saying because the actor who's closer to you sitting at a table somewhere else in the bar is louder, but you just have to adjust for the fact that it's a Robert Altman movie and trust that whatever they're saying at the bar, all you need to know is that they're talking at the bar. You don't have to hear their conversation. It's actually more interesting to eavesdrop on this other conversation happening at the bar in 1974 to get a feeling for time and place.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. I mean, there's so many things that Altman sort of like created or, really put his stamp on. And that's one. And I've always loved that ambient noise that he uses, the ambient conversations, like, because on one hand, again, it really puts you in that scene. Like you feel like you're literally there, which is, there's a strength to that kind of storytelling anyways. But it's also, it sort of catches you off guard and makes you sort of have to like pay extra attention to what's going on. You have to like really focus on what the characters are saying, like to be able to sort of, if you want to hear what they're saying, if you want to get the gist of their conversation, you're paying closer attention. And there's something I think about that makes you more engaged in the movie. Again, I've always loved that. I think a few filmmakers, I think Wes Anderson's done it a few times. There's a few filmmakers who've tried to do that, but anytime it happens in the movie, immediately I think of Robert.
Yeah, it's one of his trademarks and one of the more important things he's brought to cinema, I think.
Absolutely.
And then the third doubleheader that I'm going to mention as a special doubleheader, people who know anything about 1974 are probably already shouting out what it is. Mel Brooks with Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein in the same damn year.
Which I could have sworn that Blazing Saddles was made previous to, like, I thought it would have been like 73, 75. That blew me away that he released both those movies in the same year and both were in the top 5 gross, and which makes,
Yeah, I actually think I would put it out there. I think Mel Brooks won 1974 without winning a single Oscar or anything.
Yeah.
I think 1974 belongs to Mel Brooks. In these two films in particular, I mean, when people talk about Mel Brooks, there's probably some more attention being paid to Spaceballs nowadays just because of how big Star Wars got. I was 6 when Spaceballs came out and I loved it. By the time I was a teenager, I was really seeing how thin the threading actually was on a movie like Spaceballs. But Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein have stood up to the rewatch every single time. And I'm going to say this. I may edit this. I don't know. I want to put it out there that I want to continue enjoying Blazing Saddles for the rest of my life. And for that, I promise to never, ever quote it again. Because, man, what a powerful film. What powerful TNT he was dealing with at the time. And I think just about everyone who's aware of that movie has probably said at some point they'll never make another one like that again. But the fact of the matter is, when he was making it in 1974, he was telling his writers, put everything you want in there because you're probably never going to work again. They were completely aware of it the whole time, that this is a movie that doesn't get made. It doesn't get made now. It didn't get made in 1974. Yet there it is. And you said something really interesting about The Jerk last time we talked in the Carl Reiner episode, about how the jokes are aimed in the right direction. And that is really what makes all the difference. And Blazing Saddles, he was righteous in the way that he directed those jokes, and who in particular was considered the stupid people, morons.
Yeah, morons, exactly.
And I just wanted to put that out there before we get too far on Blazing Saddles. Now we can start talking about more of the technical joys of Blazing Saddles, but I think that you can't talk about it anymore without kind of bringing up that it has created a vacuum in which a lot of stupid white people have used it as an excuse to say abhorrent things out loud.
Yeah, you'll always have that. I mean, There's so many. There's this whole thing now. I'm sure you might have even planned on bringing this up about how now they want to air it on streaming, but with a disclaimer saying like, hey, like, the language of this film.
I'm fine with it.
I am totally fine with that. But I also, watching it, and I haven't rewatched it in probably 2 or 3 years. The last time I watched it, to me, it seems fairly obvious. Again, like you said, where the jokes are being aimed at, like who's the butt of the joke. And that obviously, like, the satire is coming from the stupidity and ignorance of racism. And, so to me, it seems really self-explanatory. But I understand, like, I have the context of having lived with that movie for a long time, and also being old enough to remember that a time outside of where we live now. Regardless of anything else, it's one of the funniest movies ever made. My mother brother used to like to tell the story that it was my dad peed his pants in the movie. He was cackling in the movie so loud that other people were paying more attention to my father. I mean, even the casting, I'm blanking on the actor's name. Originally they wanted. I have a weird opinion where I know that they wanted, if I'm not mistaken, Richard Pryor for that role.
Yes.
But I actually think the right decision was not, regardless of the circumstance of what changed it, I think what Richard Pryor would have brought to that role would have made it a different movie. Not that to say Richard Pryor wouldn't have been incredible, but Richard Pryor didn't have the presence of like a kind of a classic cowboy kind of character, I'm blanking on the actor's name, which I'm sorry for.
Cleavon Little is who you're looking for.
Cleavon Little, thank you. He brought the presence of an old film Western star who just happened to be black. He had that kind of charisma, which as much charisma as Richard Pryor has, it was a different kind of charisma. I think there's something would have been lost if Cleavon Little hadn't have done that role.
Completely agree.
And I think he's amazing in it. Obviously, my favorite actor of all time, my hero, one of my heroes, one of my many heroes, but fucking Gene Wilder, who we'll also talk about. He's perfect in that role. Like, there's so many, even though so many
wasn't supposed to be Gene Wilder either. That cast was completely different.
It's one of those films that I've tried to get people who are younger than me, people in their 20s, to sort of watch it, or people who hadn't seen it, and I can see this hesitancy, almost like a taboo thing. I don't know if that's it, but there's definitely seems like, I don't know if I should watch that, or I don't know. And it literally is still one of the funniest movies ever made.
It is. It's legitimately funny, and I think you hit the nail on the head with the casting of Cleavon Little. First off, it was supposed to be Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor is credited as one of the writers, so he was in the room.
Yeah.
As a film fan, I guess there is a part of me that the part of me that loves the what ifs. What if that had been the first pairing of Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder, because they went on to become a comedy duo after this movie?
Yeah, make a lot of movies. Not all good, but they made them.
No, not all good.
I still enjoy some of them, but
Stir Crazy's the one that stands out. I think I could probably live without all the others, but Stir Crazy. But there's redeeming factors to the other ones as well. So a lot of people love Silver Streak. Anyways, that's beside the point. I think what you're saying about Cleavon Little was that Richard Pryor would have brought an anger to it.
Yes.
And I think that Bart needed to be a character who was cooler than everybody else. And by being cooler, his anger had to manifest differently than outrage.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think Cleavon Little was much more up for it. I've also heard that Richard Pryor, the reason why he wasn't picked was because he was known to have a drug problem. And on the day that he was supposed to show up for the first script reading, he called and said he was in Detroit and had no idea how he got there. And so they kind of said, okay, that closes that. Also, on a substance abuse level, the part of the Waco Kid that was played by Gene Wilder was supposed to be played by character actor Gig Young, who had just won an Oscar for They Shoot Horses, Don't They, a couple years prior. And but Gig Young's actually, he should probably be the subject of his own film. He was a tragic figure in and of himself. He was such an incredible alcoholic. He ended up dying in a murder-suicide in which he was the perpetrator. He was the bad guy. And he will pop up again here in 1974, and probably the biggest downer that we will talk about in this entire podcast, downer of a movie. But he was removed from this movie probably because he was a downer at that point, but also because they started filming and they did that introductory scene where Waco Kid is hanging upside down in his cell, and they hung him upside down and he just started puking on himself.
I kind of saw that coming. Yeah.
And they're just like, get him out of here. Get him out of here. They brought in Gene Wilder, and Gene Wilder, again, he doesn't bring alcoholism or anger or any of those things to that part. He brings a too cool for the room approach that doubled him perfectly with Cleavon Little. And those two, as much as Mel Brooks is responsible for how great that movie is, those two are equally responsible for how great that movie is.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, is that whole sense of you nailed it with they're cooler than everybody else, but there's that sense of everybody else around us, we're surrounded by morons kind of thing, that they don't even honestly take, there's a thing of you can tell that they don't even really take even a lot of the adversarial aspects of the film too seriously. They realize they're smarter than everybody else, and there's so many great moments. But again, a lot of the stuff, some of the greatest lines you can't quote stuff. But great film, one of the most important comedies ever made. But weirdly, not my favorite of the two Mel Brooks movies. Mel Blanc.
Agreed.
Listen to some.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Why don't you take us into the next one? Because I think this is the better of the two, technically speaking.
Yeah. Young Frankenstein, which Blake Sal's was the higher of the earners, which makes sense. It was probably more controversial at the time, and more not controversial, but more exciting. But Mel Brooks
Let's call it raucous. It was more raucous. That's a fun
there you
word.
go. And then the whole ending gets, But Young Frankenstein is, basically it's like Mel Brooks making a Universal monster movie, but as a comedy, with the most incredible cast. She's starring Gene Wilder as a young Frankenstein. I know I'm saying this, but what's weirdly, I literally, and not had anything to do with this podcast, I just saw it was in my recorded films on my one of my streaming services. I rewatched it like literally like 3 days ago. But man, it's a perfect movie.
It is.
It's perfect looking. Weirdly, I never found Terry Garr attractive, but for some reason in this movie, I find her very attractive. There's something very appealing. I think maybe it's the German accent. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the
Knockers.
The Victorians, the Knockers. Yeah, I don't know, but yeah,
well, they never put her in anything that was particularly revealing. She's usually the put-upon wife. She's usually the one that has to suffer through Richard Dreyfuss finding aliens or John Denver finding God.
Exactly, or Mr. Mom being Mr. Mom.
And great performer.
Yeah, she's a great actress.
She got to let loose with this one, which you don't.
Yeah.
Usually she's the one that's playing straight man to whoever else is in the movie. In this one, she gets to be the silly one.
Yeah, and that's the thing is she's very cute. Like she's like very like there's a sweetness to the character. Obviously, stealing the whole movie. You have Marty Feldman as Igor. What a great! I mean, as a kid, I think that's the only thing I really knew of him as a kid. But as a kid, I was weirdly fascinated with Marty Feldman because I was like, is that really his eye? Can he do that? And then, of course, you go, oh no, that really is his eye.
Damn your eyes.
But why is he so fucking like? Nobody was as funny as him. Like everything he did was perfect. Like I said, definitely, all of the best bits come from him. You had. Also, I had a huge crush on as a kid, on the inverse of Terry Garr, Madeline Kahn.
Along with Wilder was a return from Blazing Saddles.
Yep. You had Gene Hackman as like the blind man. Like there's just so many, even like the supporting cast.
I heard, by the way, that Hackman got involved with this film because he was tennis partners with Gene Wilder and asked to be in the movie. He says, I want to try a comedy next. Think Mel will put me in his movie? And that's how he became the blind man in Young Frankenstein. Almost unrecognizable under that big beard. But all I can think about is what was it like being in the club with Gene and Gene? These two as friends. It's a little mind-blowing. It seems appropriate in a weird way, but they were both in Bonnie and Clyde. That's probably where they met, but not people.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Tennis partners.
Yeah, to talk about the two most different personality types. But again, I mean, if you're an actor, you have to respect Gene Wilder. And of course, obviously, vice versa. It still bothers me to this day that Peter Boyle played a bald monster. I don't know why that still bothers me. Couldn't they just added a toupee, a wig to the top? I mean,
probably, because it wasn't a Universal film, and because they were actually using the Universal. They didn't belong to Universal, but the equipment in Dr. Frankenstein's lab was the equipment from Dr. Frankenstein's lab, and actually the guy who designed it loaned it to Brooks, and it was the first time that he ever got a screen credit for having designed all that shit. Bravo to Brooks for finally giving some recognition to pretty much the creation of a mad scientist lab. That's what every mad scientist lab looks like now.
Exactly.
The script was actually Wilder's idea. Wilder was the one who came to Brooks with it. But one thing I will say that kind of draws a line between that and Blazing Saddles is I feel like Brooks made Blazing Saddles to make fun of the Western genre, whereas he made Young Frankenstein as a love letter to horror movies. So there's a different approach to the parody.
I could not agree more. In fact, that's something that, even without knowing, obviously I think we've talked about previously that, or I've talked about on some podcasts about, how interesting it is that Brooks has been such a supporter of horror films and a fan of horror films and stuff, and produced a lot of really great horror films. But without even knowing that, watching this, you can tell he genuinely does love the source material. I mean, it's probably the best, even. Yes, it's in black and white. There's a lot that you can do with that atmospherically, but I still think it's the best looking. I mean, there's just shot compositions and stuff. He knows the source material so well that he's able to sort of recreate it very faithfully, but also, use it in a comedic sense. But yeah, it's a movie I could watch. And there's a handful of movies. Not only do they just make me feel like I'm a kid again, where they just feel very comforting, but they never stop being entertaining. Like it's not even just nostalgia that I watch it for. It's that every time I watch it, I'm just as engaged, and that's a huge, huge accomplishment because with the amount of films out there, that stuff can get lost in the noise. But I mean, it's really one of the films that, like, if I had to say what are my top 10 favorite comedies, it's definitely going to be in that conversation.
Same here.
Yeah, and like I said, it's definitely it's without a doubt my favorite Mel Brooks. Without a doubt.
And it was almost
Blazing
in color,
Saddles.
by the way. Well, I shouldn't say it was almost in color. It was viciously fought over to the point where Columbia lost it. It was taken to Fox because Fox agreed that they would do it in black and white for Brooks. But Brooks was that incensed. Columbia basically said, why don't we shoot it in color and then we'll develop it in black and white? And he's like, no, you'll use that to screw me somehow. I want it shot in black and white so that nobody can change it. And so good on Fox, which doesn't exist anymore. But
that's right. Now it's just 20th century. 20th? It's just 20th, right?
It's just, I'm just going to say it's all Disney.
Exactly.
Disney's doing its best to kind of erase that, which is, we'll see what they do with the back catalog, but they seem to be erasing the name 20th Century Fox.
That they definitely are.
So until I see Young Frankenstein on Disney Plus, I'm going to assume that Disney is trying to erase Young Frankenstein, which kind of pisses me off.
Well, it is on Hulu, and Hulu is owned by Disney. So
okay. Well, I have heard that some of that stuff's going over there. You're right, and I did watch a movie on Hulu that I couldn't find anywhere this week, and it was a Fox movie. Now that I think about it, and it's one that you mentioned before that I'm just going to mention because it's fun, and that was Zardoz.
There you go. Yeah, that's right. Hulu has that. What do you think?
Okay. The story goes basically that I was late at night and I thought, I've never seen Zardoz. I think I just want to check out the first 5 minutes so that I have an idea of what it is, because I've seen the picture. Everyone knows the picture, the meme of Sean Connery with the long hair, wearing his whatever is
diaper and his thigh-high leather boots and his bandoliers, and you can just his hairy chest. Yeah.
And I just kind of had to know for myself, what is the vibe of this movie? Is it so bad it's good, or is there something there? I fully intended to watch the first 5 or 10 minutes and ended up watching the whole thing because it's kind of a fascinating train wreck. I can't say it's a good movie.
No, but it's perfectly. It's just dumb and weird enough without it being like, oh, this is unwatchable. It's like, oh, this is interesting. I actually really love the aesthetics of it. All the design stuff. I mean, it's the movie is just dumb. The script is dumb, but it's fun. I mean, that's the thing I loved about the 70s is that film can even exist. That film wouldn't exist today. Like no. That film, so
that's what science fiction looked like prior to Star Wars.
Exactly.
And as absurd as it is, there were elements of the philosophy of it that I found intriguing. The reveal of what the title Zardoz stands for is one of the most knockdown, laughable premises for a title that I'm not going to ruin it for anybody. But it is pretty amazing. You will laugh out loud when you find out what Zardoz is, aside from a big god head that floats around.
God head.
But
I actually was just somebody made a 3-dimensional sculpture, and I have it saved in my eBay checkout
of the Zardoz head.
And it's it's probably like maybe 6-7 inches tall, but I was like, that'd look good on my desk.
Yeah, why not?
Why not?
With that big, weird open mouth, probably make a good ashtray for me.
There you go.
I just kind of want to mention Zardoz in a little bit more than passing because it was a lot of fun, and it's directed by John Borman, who had done Deliverance prior to this. Yep. So it's not like it was directed by a hack. And I've even heard rumors that Stanley Kubrick was a technical advisor on this thing.
I've never heard that part. So, I mean, but the thing is, it's weirdly enough, it's probably one of the more culturally relevant films of 1974 as far as today's standards. Like, it's a film only sort of got rediscovered a few years ago because of memes and stuff, and because of people trying to unearth bad movies and be like, the vanguard of bad cinema. So I think it's a movie that weirdly enough, a lot of movies on here that probably kids in their 20s. I can't believe I'm old enough that I call them kids of their 20s, but younger people of the millennials / Gen Zers, they probably actually heard of. There's good or bad. I mean, it's an interesting thing. So
oddly enough, but it was a fairly decent sci-fi entry. But let's take it into horror, because I know you're itching to get into some horror here. I'm going to let you start with, because there's a lot to talk about in horror, and I know that you and I tend to go on and on. We may have to make this a two-parter.
It's going to be a multi-part. Yeah, at least. I mean, so obviously, if you're talking about horror, you have to talk about, and one of the highest earning film in the, I think, top 15, and probably the most seminal. I will go on his record as saying it's the most important horror film of its generation, which is Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So obviously, if you're listening to this podcast, you've heard of it. I would I'm assuming, this movie came, and this isn't a year that had a ton of great and also groundbreaking horror films. Like, Black Christmas is very important and, had a huge impact on filmmakers and stuff. But definitely the big one, the most important one of this year is definitely Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We don't need to talk about it. Most people should know it. But this was a movie that came out and even for the next 20, 30 years was insidious. Like, you would bring that up and it would stir all these like incorrect visions in people's mind, because ironically, for a film that's people have this impression that it's one of the most gory films ever made, has very little on-screen gore. Most of the violence is implied. It's more about the creepiness of it, using a very much more, instead of a gothic terror, it's more of a grounded in reality. It's still over the top. Like I said, they say it's based on Ed Gein. There's a lot of movies based on Ed Gein, and none of them are super accurate, super faithful to what actually happened. But this one's probably was the most fantastical as far as man wearing a leather skin mask, which is, there's some historical fact based in there. But regardless, it's definitely Leatherface became an icon, spawned a ton of sequels and remakes and all kinds of things. But it's a movie that I promise you, if you've seen it, it's made a lasting impression on you. It's one of the most realistic feeling horror movies ever, despite a lot of the over top elements. It's so
it takes
disturbing.
A while for the over the top elements to get to you. By the time that you get to the really over the top stuff, like the dinner sequence, you've been served a pretty realistic tale so far. So once you get to that point, you're on board. You're willing to believe this is happening to this poor woman, Sally, and it's nuts. It's absolutely nuts. Yeah,
and that's the thing, is it's like it feels like an actual nightmare. It just feels like everything is going more and more off the rails as it goes on, and it ends in probably one of the single most disturbing endings. Just that poor actress's face, and just she's basically, at that point, she's gone. Like, she's lost her mind from terror. But there's so much you could talk about it. Again, it was the first movie that felt dirty. The first, especially, movie like that went mainstream. Obviously, you had films prior to it, the Herschel Gordon Lewis movies, a lot of movies that also felt dirty and grimy, but were a little bit less, not even a little bit less, but, much less successful. This was very notorious and enough, like I said, that was a top 20, at the box office, which is not something that at that time that you didn't see horror get like that, not since Alfred Hitchcock kind of, the bigger, more kind of respected horror films. But then again, you had Black Christmas this year, which is a great movie. Not going to go into it too much, but it's one of the foundations of slashers. There's a lot of things that it's sort of a proto slasher, but it also has a lot of influence on slashers. One of the say something, Devin?
Yeah, I was just going to mention, to me, Black Christmas, I struggled with this as to whether or not it's really a slasher, whether it's the start of the slashers, because so many people give it to Halloween. But there are arguments in favor of Texas Chainsaw and Black Christmas, but ultimately it's similar in my mind to the film noir argument, where you look at a movie like Casablanca that has all the cornerstones of what a noir movie would be, the lighting, even the cast. Everything about Casablanca reflects what noir was, but it's not a noir film. It's just not there. There's something, you know it when you see it. And the same with Texas Chainsaw, and the same with Black Christmas. And I was going to say Black Christmas is really much more like an Italian giallo film, but undoubtedly a primary influence on what became the slasher film, especially the holiday slasher film.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. Had a huge impact on, just like, with it, Halloween, and there's, that tendency to make them like holiday themed, which is still to this day, like, you still see one every few years, like,
Happy Birthday to Me. And
but there's a lot of these that like people are still trying to ape that idea with, there's just one I just heard about coming out, I'm blanking on the name, but it's like Arbor Day or something. It's something like that. But yeah, it's a great movie. For a long time, it was really underappreciated and not like sort of skated over. I think it's now finally starting to get the respect it deserves. You have one of my favorite Vincent Price movies, Madhouse, which I still think more people should probably appreciate.
I love Madhouse. Really, I almost got a tattoo from Madhouse
of his of the makeup
of Dr. Death, or
perfect. It's sort of, it's such a love letter to the previous era of horror. Like, it's using a lot of the things by 1974 that were a little corny or seemed not as scary, and sort of kind of played off of that. And Vincent Price was a great actor, but obviously, like, certain people that always dismissed him as being like, oh, the guy that makes the low budget horror movies and but I think this was like, he fucking went balls out. I mean, he's a great actor no matter what he did, but there's something about this performance which just feels a little bit more truly like there's a pitifulness to it, and obviously like, you know, like the like paranoia insanity aspect to it. But yeah, I think it's I think by 1974 you started to see, like I said, the divide between old school horror and then this new, especially like with 74 really starting to kick it off with Texas Chainsaw Massacre and then Black Christmas and then Death Dream and a few of these movies that are a little bit more.
Oh, and by the way, Death Dream, it's another double header. Black Christmas and Death Dream, both directed by Bob Clark.
Bob Clark, that's right. Yeah, I completely forgot he did Death Dream. Ooh,
and he did A Christmas Story. Just to point out fun fact that the director of Black Christmas went on to make the most famous Christmas movie of all time. Christmas Story.
All time, yeah. But, you know, then you also had, I mean, in the same year, you had a ton of things. You had Frightmare, which is a movie I enjoy, but it's not a great movie.
No, it's not great. But can I mention something that with Madhouse?
Oh, yeah, of course.
First off, you got to love Vincent Price. He is probably in my top 10. He's just one of my favorites. I love to watch him in anything. I kind of wish that I had known him in real life. Out of all the actors that I've studied and really gotten into, he's probably the actor that I would have gotten along with the most. I would have called him up to hang out on a Saturday night. But Peter Cushing is also in Madhouse. And the reason I want to mention Peter Cushing is because he is the other champion of 1974. I looked it up after realizing how many double headers we had in directing. I also started to realize that like Elliot Gould was in 4 movies and Ellen Burstyn was in 3 movies. And there's all these actors that were just getting a lot of work. The winner out of all of them, Peter Cushing, with 9 movies coming out in 1974.
9 movies. Okay. So you had the Hammer Frankenstein film.
Yes, also a Hammer Dracula came out that year.
That's right. I'm trying to think of what 9 films he would have been in 1970.
I don't know if we're going to get them all from memory, but I know that there was Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, Dracula and the Seven Brothers, which was a Hammer and Shaw Brothers collaboration. Another Hammer and Shaw Brothers collaboration was Shatter, which wasn't a horror movie at all. It was more of a like their version of a Dirty Harry movie, but Cushing's in that. He's in Madhouse, as we just mentioned. Yep. Oh, God, I don't know if I'm going to be able – that's 4 of them.
I mean, well, you know what? Honestly, one of our future episodes we should talk about, you know.
Maybe we'll do Cushing. Yeah, Cushing and Lee, but something like that. Christopher Lee was in a few things. And Christopher Lee, this was the year that Christopher Lee went from being a Hammer icon to being a Bond villain.
That's right.
With The Man with the Golden Gun came out in 1974.
Yep.
I'm not going to spend too much time getting into a James Bond movie, though. We've got more horror movies to talk about.
That's right. Well, I mean, there's a ton this year. One of the ones I want to talk about, just because I think it's a really interesting it's part of an interesting little trilogy, is The Ghost Galleon.
I don't know this one.
So it's the second in the Blinded trilogy. The first one is, but yeah, so you have the original, The Blind Dead, Return of the Blind Dead. The second one is The Ghost Galleon, and the final one is Night of the Seagulls, which is one of the least threatening horror movie titles ever, but it's actually so it's basically, it talks about these like Templar knights who were basically accused of witchcraft and heresy and basically had their eyes plucked out by birds and basically stuck in this cave in these tombs, and they get through swinging 70s, Spanish tourists, they get unwittingly get revived and stuff. And it goes through 3 movies. The first one takes place amongst the beautiful Spanish countryside and through all these ruins and stuff. And then the second one is basically them going to this, like they're on a ship, aka the Ghost Galleon and stuff. Ultimately they're very of the period. They're these sort of Euro horrors, these sort of Gothic infused sort of, satanic. They're just so iconic. The Blind Dead themselves are so iconic. These like shrouded skeletal like zombie knights and stuff. And the violence is pretty gnarly in all 3 of the films. But it's a great little trilogy. It's got a lot of over the top Euro acting, a lot of 70s charm to it. They look really good, especially they've had some some Blu-rays released recently that have really good transfers. It's the 3 of them. I mean, I think the Return of the Blind Dead is the best of the 3, and I think Night of the Seagulls and the Ghost Galleon are sort of tied after that as being, they're still really fun, but I still think the first one the best. You sort of setting up the mythology or whatever, but they're really great. I feel like horror fans, a lot of diehard horror fans are probably big fans, but I don't know if they're that popular by the mainstream audience. But they're definitely, of 1974, probably one of my favorite films of that year. But I don't know if it can. And then you have Beyond the. There's tons of great movies.
Beyond the Door is a good one.
Beyond the Door is a fucking great one.
Lisa and the Devil is another good one. Is it Beyond the Door? Was that Bava or was that?
It was Bava, yes.
Okay, so we have another double header here. We have Beyond the Door and Lisa and the Devil.
Oh, no, it wasn't actually. It was directed by Assonitis and Robert Piazzoli.
Oh, that's who I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Okay, never mind. But regardless, Beyond the Door is a really fascinating movie, and Lisa and the Devil, if anybody gets it, is an interesting movie. There were a couple that were produced by Andy Warhol in 1974.
Yeah, there were, yes. Was it The Flesh of Frankenstein this year?
Both of them, and Blood for Dracula.
And Blood for Dracula, yeah. Yeah, dude. I've always, I mean, I'm not going to qualify Andy Warhol as necessarily a filmmaker, but, you know.
No, experimental. Yeah. I'll give him that much.
More of a.
And neither one of these were directed by Warhol. They were directed by Paul Morrissey.
Yep, correct.
And who did a lot of work for Warhol. He was part of the Factory, but these were his two horror contributions. They're really campy and gory and a lot of fun, actually, but not in the typical way that you would say that a horror movie is a lot of fun. They're really kind of fun in just kind of their own way. Another one that I really loved from this year, horror-wise, kind of a companion piece to Texas Chainsaw, I suppose, was Deranged, which got the Ed Gein story a lot closer.
That's what I was actually. So, yeah, in fact, I didn't even know that was 74, but I talked about this on a different podcast. But yeah, like, it's definitely the most faithful. I mean, it's not super faithful, but of the big, Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's definitely the most faithful, and honestly a really interesting movie. I don't know why it's not more well known. Like,
I think because people didn't understand the sense of humor. There's a lot in the movie that's funny that comes off as so bad it's good when it's actually intentional humor.
Yeah.
So I think that, and the fact that it probably just got buried by Texas Chainsaw in terms of Ed Gein lore, even though it is the closer story. The real story of Ed Gein, it is fascinating, but it's really much more of a grave robber story than a serial killer story. He's not even a serial killer. He killed two people, and more than likely he killed the two people to add to his collection of bodies that he dug up. Because he was missing a piece, because he was, things like that. What he did to the dead bodies when he dug them up was terrifying, disturbing, all the stuff that nightmares are made of. But he was not the serial killer that movies have made him out to be.
No, exactly. And that's the thing, is he's almost a pathetic character. Like, he's simple-minded and, I mean, he wasn't Leatherface, definitely.
He was much more Roberts Blossom in Deranged.
Yeah, absolutely.
What a performance. Still one of my favorite performances in a horror movie. Roberts Blossom as, Ezra Cobb. Is that his name in... I think it's Ezra
That sounds
Cobb.
Like it's very... Yeah, very farmer sounding, yes.
That's the name for him in Deranged. And his relationship with his mother and his relationship with all of his neighbors. I mean, it's the perfect sort of, he was such a quiet man sort of role.
Yeah.
But seeing his inner workings, and you do get a sense of the patheticness, the fact that he was such a mama's boy to an abusive level.
Yep.
That it's hard to make the determination, and I don't know that you're necessarily supposed to make the determination of whether he is a product of nature or nurture. Whether he was born this way or whether his mother just completely screwed him up in raising him. But he's a complete social nitwit, doesn't know what he's doing, oftentimes gets by in society because he says something that he's serious about and everybody else around him thinks he's being funny. Great movie. I can't say enough nice things about it.
No, and it's one of those films that, like, I feel like it probably had, like, for a lot of filmmakers, especially in the 80s, probably had a big influence. I think filmmakers probably saw it because I can see its influence in other films. It just weirdly, with a widespread audience, with the film going public, it's not even when I bring it up to people who are fans of 70s horror and stuff, it's not even one that usually comes up in conversation.
And the atmosphere is so creepy. You're just waiting for the other shoe to drop for a lot of the movie, and the music is all hymns played on an organ.
That's right.
Like an old pipe organ.
Yeah, that's right.
So the religious element of that is brought out by the music, and not without having to go so far into actually making it a film that comments on religion and how it can be distorted into bad behavior.
Exactly, and damaging to Exactly. Well said, Devin. I'm obviously there's a lot we could talk about. I mean, I feel like I can't. If there's a Larry Cohen movie released in a year, I have to talk about a Larry Cohen movie.
Yes,
It's Alive, which is still one of the more. I don't know why it works. I don't know why that movie works.
It shouldn't.
It should not work. But man, it's so much fun. I like all Larry Cohen movies. It's just super fun. But I have to talk about it's horror related. I definitely do not consider it a traditional horror movie. But goddamn it, it's one of my favorite. Literally one of my favorite movies. In fact, I just bought a vintage 2-sheet poster of the film. More than I should have spent. Brian De Palma's masterpiece by the greatest songwriter of all time, Phantom of the Paradise.
Yes.
What? I can't say enough about this movie. Literally everything about it makes me happy. It was a movie I grew up watching, on cable or whatever. Really interesting backstory. There's actually a really interesting documentary coming out soon, I hope. I think it's coming out soon for, available streaming, but about its impact in Canada, in Winnipeg, I think. Is it Winnipeg?
Winnipeg specifically?
Yeah, so I can't...
I'm fascinated. I don't know about this.
So...
You're the reason I saw it. I would have caught Phantom, I'm sure, eventually. But I definitely know that I saw Phantom of the Paradise because of you. And thank you for that.
My pleasure. So when it came out, it was a flop everywhere. It didn't do well. People just didn't understand it, except for one Canadian town, which people loved it. And it was made all this. It basically made all of its money in this Canadian city, and it never stopped running. It played every midnight, even it had its first run there at the time with film distribution being what it was. It sort of once a print landed there, then this town was like, no, we need this movie all the time, and it played on midnight screenings. I think it's played consistently since 1974 weekly there, and it's where the convention, the Phantom of the Paradise convention, which is called, I think, God damn it, I'm blanking. It's not Swan Song, but there's a big convention. Paul Williams has been there. Garrett Graham and people have gone there and actually performed songs. Anyways, but there's a documentary about how this one town just loved this weird oddball musical. Yeah, it's really fast. I'm really looking forward to that. There's another documentary about the film as well. I think it came out in 2010, 2011, more of a making of. But this one's going to be a little more interesting just because it's about its impact and stuff. But the movie's perfect. It's perfect. Paul Williams basically plays this evil, not to give any spoilers away, but this evil record impresario, this record producer / nightclub owner, and he basically just uses people, and he's trying to find the next big hit. He has a nostalgia act called the Juicy Fruits, which is very much like a Beach Boy, like a 50s, not Beach Boys at first. It's more of
it's whatever he needs it to be.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the Beach Boys at one point, and it's like a Sha Na sort of thing.
Exactly.
At another point.
Exactly. And I think that's what, in fact, I think in 1974, it was kind of making fun of Sha Na and the nostalgia thing that was happening.
I think we just lost one of the bandmates, Ben Cross. Wasn't he one of the actors? Yes.
Yeah, he's one of the guys in the band, in Meat's band and stuff. Yes.
And he was not known for that movie. He was known for Spock's Dad and Barnabas Collins and a lot of other great things. And so the world mourns the loss of Ben Cross. But yes, I did notice he was in this movie as well.
But yeah, it's one of those movies that just it shouldn't work, but it does. Yeah. The vastly underrated William Finley plays. I'm all of a sudden blanking on the character's name, even though. Damn it! Why am I blanking on the character's name? I say it all the time.
I'm so used to calling him just the Phantom, even when I'm
Winslow Leach. Winslow Leach.
Yes.
So Winslow Leach is this kind of singer-songwriter guy. He has no charisma. He's a goofy-looking, lanky dude, but he's a brilliant songwriter. And Paul Williams' character Swan recognizes in him and basically manipulates him into signing over a contract that gives no spoilers, but even though this movie's been around since 1974, if I can get somebody to watch it for the first time, I'll live the life of purpose. But anyways, it's basically like a rock opera version of Phantom of the Opera. There's actually mixed with Legends of Faust, the old German legend of Faust, which that kind of gives you some spoilers right there. But the music is great. Paul Williams, who, if you don't know who Paul Williams is, all you need to know is that he wrote Rainy Days and Mondays and Rainbow Connection. So right there, he's the greatest song. I have a photo of him literally right next to my desk. At the time he was known for this kind of like family friendly, soft rock, pop rock, or not even pop rock, just say pop hits and stuff with like the Carpenters and stuff and the Monkees. But he plays an evil villain in this really well. Garrett Graham steals the whole movie every time he shows up. But it cannot be said, the unbelievable talent of Jessica Harper in this movie, who plays Phoenix, who has a voice of an angel. I don't know how she didn't have a bigger career after this.
She's in some of my favorite stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, Suspiria and this she'll have a legacy forever. But
Suspiria, Pennies from Heaven is another one that I really love, and I know I'm leaving some out.
Oh, she's done a lot. She was in a Richard Dreyfuss movie. I think it was actually the first thing she did was some Richard Dreyfuss movie. I can't even remember. At old age is making my brain like cheddar cheese. But yeah, it's a great movie. The songs are great. The hell of it, the song that closes out the film, is one of the most brilliant songs ever written, and I quote it all the time. It's so brilliant. But yeah, it's Brian De Palma, which not what he's known for. Was not known for at this time. But he was a big music fan. One of those movies that did not do well upon its release, very much like a Rocky Horror, very similar story. This fantastical, like sort of rock musical that wasn't loved at the time when it came out. Even though for Rocky, the stage production was well respected. Elvis was a huge fan, but
Elvis was a big fan of Black Christmas, by the way, too. I discovered.
Yes. I think that's correct. Yes, we can talk about Elvis on a different episode, but I have a lot to say. But yeah, it's definitely, without doubt, of all the brilliant films, Texas Chainsaw, Godfather Part 2. I'm brilliant. This is definitely my favorite movie of this year because it's one of my favorite movies ever made. But can't say enough about it. If you like weirdo musicals, this is a must watch. So 2 enthusiastic thumbs up. But yeah, Devin, I think we may need to break this up into 2 parts because I'm starting to get aches in my rear end.
All right, folks. Well, there's still so much to talk about 1974. If we haven't mentioned your favorite film yet, that's because we're going to go ahead and just split these up and do a second 1974 because we haven't even gotten around to all of my favorite movies of the year yet. This is just such a great year. And I know James has probably got several that he's got.
There's still more. Yeah, there's still more that need to be talked about. Yeah,
there's entire genres we haven't hit yet. So, and a couple of oddballs that don't really belong to any genre, which is sometimes my favorite thing. So we're gonna meet again. We're gonna finish this up this week. I'm gonna try to get this up as soon as I possibly can. But if you're listening to this right now on any of our outlets, we're on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, anywhere you want to find a podcast, that's where we are. Keep looking because you're not going to have to wait so long this time for a second episode. We are going to follow this up and get 1974 knocked out of the park. Anything you'd like to say to finish things up, James?
No, just that this was definitely, even going into it, I knew this was going to be, there was a lot to discuss with this year, but even getting into it, it's like, man, we just were at the tip of the iceberg with 1974. So I'm excited to finish this conversation.
All right, me too. All right, folks, you take care of yourselves. You'll be hearing from us very soon.